Welcome to this microfocus video presentation. My name is Noor Rizwan and I am working as a lead engineer in ZENworks Configuration Management. In this video, I am going to talk about multifactor authentication feature for ZENworks Administrator, which is coming in ZENworks 2020 Update 3. So, what is multi-factor authentication? Multi-factor authentication is an authentication method that requires the user to provide two or more verification factors to gain access to a resource such as an application. In this video, I am going to talk about why we need multi-factor authentication, what exactly it is, and how it is integrated in ZENworks configuration management. I am also going to talk about how to configure advanced authentication in ZENworks management. Why multi-factor authentication is required? In recent past, we have seen that millions of passwords were stolen. There are different methods using which passwords can be stolen, such as using phishing, social engineering, and malware. Also, because of current pandemic situation around the world, more and more applications are getting exposed to DMZ, which increases the attack surface as well. Hence, it is necessary that we add more layer of security around our application. What is multi-factor authentication and how does it solve? And how does it make your application more secure? Multi-factor authentication, as discussed, authenticates a user using more than one authentication mechanism or authentication methods. Since these authentication methods or authentication factors are distinct in nature, even if one factor is compromised, let's say password, it is difficult to compromise, or it is highly unlikely that the other factor can also get compromised. Let's discuss about what are those three factors in multi-factor authentication. The first factor as shown here is something that you know, which is the password or answer to security question. The second factor, which is different from the first factor, is that something that you have or you possess, such as a mobile phone. In mobile phone, we can get a one-time password, which can act as a authentication method. And third factor of authentication is that that's something you are. If you can use your fingerprint or retinal scan only if you are physically there. Since these three factors are totally distinct and it is difficult for all of these to get compromised at once. This is what makes multi-factor authentication more secure. Now we will talk about how multi-factor authentication is integrated in our ZENworks control center. So for that, we will know what is advanced authentication. Advanced authentication is a microfocus solution for multi-factor authentication. So in addition to username and password authentication, it also provides different other types of authenticators, such as fingerprint authenticator, email OTP, etc. In the next slide, we can see these are few of the authentication method which advanced authentication server supports, and there are many more supported, such as smartphones, hard tokens, soft tokens, email OTP, voice calls, fingerprint, LDAP password, etc. Next, we will talk about how we configure advanced authentication server first. So there are two steps in configuring advanced authentication in ZENworks. In step 1, we configure advanced authentication server itself. In step 2, we configure the details of advanced authentication server in ZENworks Control Center. So before we configure advanced authentication server, let me brief about few of the terminologies that is used in advanced authentication server. In advanced authentication framework ecosystem, we have different terminologies such as authentication method, authentication chain, authentication event, endpoints, and user repository. So what is an authentication method? Authentication method is something which verifies the identity of a user who wants to get access to an application. Identity can be verified using LDAP password or using fingerprint or using SMS OTP or email OTP. So these are the examples of authentication method. What is authentication chain? Once we combine one or more authentication method, it forms a chain. So a user must pass all the methods in the chain to get successfully authenticated. A chain can be created for a single user also, or it can be created for a group of users as well. User devices are the endpoint devices which triggers an event, which in turn presents screens for authentication. User repository is the repository of the user where user information is present. It can be a local user source or it can be an LDAP user source. So as discussed, as you can see, we have method A and method B on the left side, which is an example of OTP or let's say LDAP password. The chain is the combination of one or more authentication method. In our case, it is a combination of method A and method B. On the right side, you can see endpoint T. In our case, endpoint can be our ZENworks control center, which triggers an event. The event is triggered once user successfully authenticates using username and password. Next, we will talk about configuring administrators in ZENworks for MFA. So once we enable multi-factor authentication for a repository, we can also enable multi-factor authentication at different levels. The first level is at AA servers. At advanced authentication server level, we can disable the multi-factor authentication at zone level, or we can also enable it. The second level is administrator group level, where for an administrator group, you can disable multi-factor authentication or you can enable it. The third level is administrator level. If you want to exclude an administrator or you want to enable multi-factor authentication only for a few administrators, we can use, you can enable multi-factor authentication at administrator level. We have total 3 options here. The first option is inherited. If we select inherited, multi-factor authentication will be enabled only if multi-factor is enabled for any one of the group user belongs to. If we select second option, as enabled, multi-factor authentication will be enabled for the given admin. If we select disabled, multi-factor authentication will be disabled for the given admin. Also, uh, make a note that multi-factor authentication is not available for default administrator. This is purposefully done so that default administrator login can be used to rectify any issues which arises in advanced authentication server configuration. After this, I will proceed to the demo of advanced authentication server configuration in ZENworks, and I will also show how an user is authenticated using multi-factor authentication. Let's switch back to the demo. This is my advanced authentication server login screen. Step 1 is to log into advanced authentication server admin console. I enter my username and password here. As we have discussed different terminologies that is used in advanced authentication server or AA server. We have repositories where you can configure user sources, or you can add local users also. You can add different LDAPs, or you can add user from a database such as Oracle or MS SQL Server. You can see authentication methods as we discussed. Each authentication method authenticates an user. Advanced authentication provide several types of authentication methods such as smartphone, SMS OTP, LDAP password, email OTP, and so on. As we discussed, when we combine one or more authentication method, it forms a chain, and a user must authenticate all the chains successfully. So the next tab is for creating a chain. So let's say I open one of the pre-configured chain. Here we have an option to provide the name for a chain. I can add one or more methods. If I select a method from left side, I can add multiple methods in this list. We have also discussed that a chain can be associated with a user or with a user group. So in this case, as you can see, this authentication chain is enabled for all users and also for auto SMK Active Directory users. In the same way, I can specify a single user or a group of users also, for which I want to enable this authentication methods. You may configure different chain for different group of users. So once you have created the chain, the next thing is the creation of an event. So as we discussed, event is triggered by an application which needs multi-factor authentication. So in our case, ZENworks Control Center will trigger an event, and we have created one sample event here named as GCCR2. Let me show you the details of GCCR2 chain. In an event, you have to provide an event name, which is for identification. We have to select an event type, which is always OAuth2 or OpenID Connect, because the event is triggered by a web application, and web application uses OAuth2. Once we have selected the event type, now we select one or more chains. So there are few pre-configured chains such as LDAP, password only chain or password only chain. We can also configure our own chain as shown here in the previous tab. And that chain can be associated with some user or some group of users. For our demo purpose, I have added a pre-configured chain LDAP password, so which will prompt for LDAP password for the second factor authentication. Client ID is an auto-generated ID which we need to use in ZENworks Control Center. Redirect URIs should be registered in Advanced Authentication Server so that if the second factor authentication succeeds or a multi-factor authentication succeeds, the Advanced Authentication Server can redirect me back to one of the registered URLs. The next field is reset client secret. Here we can add a secret which is like a password. So this completes the configuration of an event. So here we have seen how a chain is created with different methods, and we have associated a user group and user in a chain, and an event is created which contains one or more chains. Now let's move to ZENworks GCC configuration for Advanced Authentication Server. First, I will log in with a super administrator. A super administrator can configure Advanced Authentication Server in ZENworks. I will click on Configuration tab. Here we can see Advanced Authentication Server Configuration snapshot. In order to add a new configuration, we can click on New and we can add all the relevant details. I have already created one Advanced Authentication Server details here. Let me click and show the details. So here first field is the name field, which can be for your identification. In description field, we can add some description about this server. In host name, I have to provide the host name of Advanced Authentication Server. I will be able to see the certificate issued to Advanced Authentication Server also. The next field is tenant name. If an Advanced Authentication Server has a tenant created, we can add a tenant name here. If we use a default tenant, then we do not need to provide a tenant name. Event name, client ID, and client secret is the one which we have added in Advanced Authentication Server. So if you see, the event name is GCC2 and we have client ID and client secret here, which we need to configure back. Redirect URI will be generated for convenience, and we can copy this redirect URI from here and we can register in Advanced Authentication Server by pasting it in this field. We also need to add user sources for which we wanted to enable Advanced Authentication Server. I can select one or more user sources for which I want to associate an Advanced Authentication Server. I can also have one more Advanced Authentication Server running and which can be associated with some other user source. This completes the ZENworks Advanced Authentication Server configuration. So as we discussed earlier, we have to configure Advanced Authentication Server for an administrator or a group of administrators. So let's go to Administrator tab. Once you create a new administrator, you can see a new option here, multi-factor authentication, which can be either enabled or it can be disabled or it can be inherited for a new administrator. By default, at the zone label, multi-factor authentication is disabled. We can also configure multi-factor authentication at administrator group level. So as you can see, we have two options, either disable or enable at administrator group level. If I disable multi-factor authentication for a group, it will be disabled for all admins in that group. And if we want to selectively override and enable only for a few admin, we can do it at admin level. For the sample, I have created one LDAP user named FTP, and I have enabled the multi-factor authentication for this user. Let me click on this. As you can see, multi-factor authentication status is shown here, which is currently enabled, and it is enabled at this user label /administrator/ftp at automationad.com. If I want this user to inherit the multi-factor authentication from group, I can select inherit. If I want to override the multi-factor authentication status and I want to disable for this user, I can select disabled. For the demo purpose, I have enabled for this user. Now I will show you a demo of user login. So I will log out from the current session. Let me log in with FTP user. So I hit login button. Now you can see it is redirecting me to advanced authentication server page. Since I had configured the default LDAP password authentication method as my second factor authentication, so it is prompting me for an LDAP password. If I would have configured one-time password, it would have prompted me for one-time password and I would have received password in my mobile. Let me enter a wrong password here. And as you can see, login is failed and I won't get access to my ZENworks even though I have successfully authenticated using my first factor, which enhances the security of your overall ZENworks. Now I will show you by adding the right password. And here we go. The user FTP at automation AD is successfully logged in. So this completes the demo for user login. Few points are, if we want to get access to advanced authentication server, it is provided, the license is provided as an entitlement to you. For further details about advanced authentication server configuration, we can use this link where we have more details about how to configure different authentication methods, etc. in advanced authentication server. So in summary, we have discussed the importance of multi-factor authentication as how it can enhance the security of ZENworks Control Center. We have discussed about NetIQ Advanced Authentication, which is the multi-factor authentication solution offered by Micro Focus. We have also seen how to configure an event chain with one or more authentication methods in NetIQ Advanced Authentication product. After that, we have configured ZENworks Control Center to use advanced authentication, and we have seen how an administrator login can be secured by multi-factor authentication. So you can go through more details about advanced authentication server in the link provided. Thank you.